started doing this little series of talks about 7 years ago, and it was the request of the management, and I said, you know, I've been doing this seminar for undergraduates, and the audience at Evergreen is going to be a little senior to that. And they said, no, they want to hear from one of their own. And I don't like that. I hope I am one of your own. Now, we're on to a topic that could be very sharply focused and aimed at kind of geopolitical context, namely the whole notion of people getting along with each other, and particularly having a voice in their own government. Our title today is democracy, and there are two words here, demos and karti. I don't speak Greek fluently, so if you do, forgive me, but those two words, demos means people, and karti means to rule. And that's the way democracy began. To rule by the people, citizen rulers, so to speak. And it began to develop in the 6th century BC, around the Mediterranean, and then particularly in Greece. And the notion was that you had to find a way of governing that permitted the ordinary people in your constituency to have a voice, a meaningful voice. In the beginning, somebody's got a football. In the beginning, when democracy first kind of evolved around the Mediterranean, it was an empty vessel. Many of you, if I asked you what is democracy, I suspect I'd hear things like one man, one vote, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so on. There was no content to the concept of democracy. It was just an idea. And it was connected to two questions. Number one, tell me, buddy, do you think you can form a government that will be helpful to all the people? One. Two, who is going to do the governing? Now those questions have remained ever since. But Greece had the great advantage of producing interesting characters, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and one character that you may have heard me talking about in this room over the last few years, but for some of you, I suspect it will be a new name, and that is Solon, S-O-L-O-N. Remember when we used to pick up the New York Times and they would talk about congressmen and senators as Solons, which means lawgivers. The Solon of ancient Greece in around 600 BC devised a form of government that consisted of a large group of representatives, a smaller group, and then a tribunal. In other words, a Congress, a Senate, and a judiciary. And he adopted certain codes of behavior, one of them being that he would refuse to have slaves or to trade in slaves. Another was that he refused to accept the post of president or a lifetime appointment to some equally prestigious role. And because he believed you serve your people for a reasonable period of time and you return to civilian life. In other words, he was a pretty enlightened character. And the government that he devised survived, evolved eventually into Periclean democracy in ancient Athens. Pericles was elected 15 times. The difference between that government and any other democracy you've ever heard of is that it was direct democracy. That meant everybody could participate eyeball to eyeball. All government activities were open to all citizens. Now, Athens had about 100,000 people at that point. 50% of them were women and slaves. And the other 50% included a lot of impoverished peasants who were unable to really participate. So by and large, 10 to 15,000 men became citizens who could go to the hillsides outside of Athens every day or any day they were sitting and literally participate in what might be something like a congressional hearing or a Senate hearing today for a House. The difference being that you could speak up, you could ask questions, and you could be part of the decision and do the voting. So one man, one vote began in 600 BC. I don't think any other democracy was quite that close to being direct. There are all kinds of democracies all over the years. After Greece, the Romans adopted democracy, starting in about 509, going to 27 BC. And they introduced representation. They would have two groups of people, the kind of affluent landowners had their delegations, and the working peasants had their delegations. So they had two bodies, but they weren't able to vote. Solon decided not to give land away. In other words, not to take the land of the rich nobility. The rich nobility in Greece were landowners. Solon came from a very wealthy family, but his father squandered all their holdings and he had to go off and be a shipbuilder. And that incidentally influenced the life of Greece and in many ways our own life, because he built these ships and joined with other ship owners to build a fleet of vessels that could go to the dozens and dozens of small islands in the Aegean Sea and visit other cultures and bring back information to Athens that allowed them to do a lot of things, including academic disciplines and various arts and many, many crafts. And all of that enriched Athens and enriched, in a sense, the Western world. Now, one problem that always plagued the early Democrats was the tension between the individual and the community. You had an agreed set of rules and principles that everybody's going to live by, but who is going to make sure that the individual was not tyrannized by the group? And how did you balance that out? It is a conversation that goes on still, as we all know, and as we see it around us in many ways. Now, rather than just pontificate on historic details, I thought for my last paper before my own that I would like to bring in personal experience and the intimacy between individuals and their democracy. The person I selected will come perhaps as no surprise to any of you, or maybe as a great surprise. She was a young lady in her 20s when I met her. She came to our office in Beverly Hills and presented herself carrying a large kind of semi-leather portfolio that was so large she couldn't get her arms around this way or this way. So she had to kind of drag it along the sidewalk. She didn't drive, she had no car, and she had just lost her job, which was a kind of very low-level contract with 20th Century Fox to make films. They let her go because they just couldn't find out. They couldn't see anything they could really do with her that would be useful. Her opening words when I came and introduced myself, I was the only correspondent in our office at that time. It was lunchtime. All the other 7 people were out to lunch. I was filing a story on Howard Hughes, and I therefore had to be at my desk. And the receptionist said, "You want to come out and talk to this girl. She insists she's got to see a life correspondent." And I went and introduced myself, and her opening words were, "This is, what is the word? Demos. This is a democracy," she said, "and I want my job back." What happened from then on for several years that I knew her quite well, and incidentally I said to her, "What is your name?" And she said, "Marilyn Monroe." I didn't know who Marilyn Monroe was. Nobody knew who Marilyn Monroe was. She hadn't made a film, and she had no particular reputation. And she was a very attractive looking young woman, but heaven knows there were a lot of attractive young women in Hollywood who were trying to get jobs out there. But over a period of maybe 4 or 5 years, I saw a great deal of her. And I wrote a mini biography of her for the editors in New York, because we ended up doing 7 covers of Marilyn. But I want to show you the first one. And I want to make it clear that this is all very much associated with the topic we're on today. And here it is. Do you remember that? That was black and white. It had the life slug went in up here. That copy of Life sold an extra $1 million at the newsstands. And this picture was sold at Bloomingdale's in a frame for $65, and apparently they sold hundreds of thousands of them. And this is an unknown, impecunious young woman without a family who had been brought up in foster homes, had very limited schooling, but had an absolute fixation on her rights, women's rights in particular. And above all, she believed women, young women, had the right to get a job and to work. And when I looked at the biography I wrote of her, 26 pages, 4 of them were concerned with this women's rights thing. And I learned over time that she went to meetings. She never marched in the streets. She never carried a banner. When she talked to me about women's rights, she looked me in the eye and never shifted, never changed her glance, and talked about it in a very serious and restraining way. I mean, it surprises me that I didn't report more on this, but I certainly found with a little research that nobody reported on it. A lot of people knew of her fixation, but it has never been in the mountain of press that she has got. I wanted to bring that up as a kind of exemplar of how people in our lifetime, have used the Constitution and the freedoms and rights it provides as a matter that you just took for granted. So many of us grew up without a real sense, a noticeable sense of the freedoms that our system, with all its faults and all of its breakdowns, nonetheless made more people on the planet want to live in this country than anywhere else. It still does. And we still take a great deal for granted. I had the good fortune to have a mother who served in the United States Navy, as some of you know, in World War I. And because she had had a military career, all kinds of literature would come to the house and all kinds of invitations to various things. We almost had a love affair with democracy. Every president's birthday was celebrated. Boy Scouts saluted flags every day. There was a little military band that played in every ceremony relevant to American history. I can remember rushing down on Memorial Day with my mother to watch the early morning parade. The town was South Orange, New Jersey, 16,000 people. We had mock elections in the classrooms, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. We saluted the flag and did the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. We were intensely aware of our democracy and intensely aware of the great leaders, the founders. I've encountered people recently and for many, many years in Europe and elsewhere who marvel at the fact that Americans have so little knowledge of their own history and so little awareness of their own good fortune, even with the criticisms and the weaknesses that evolved out of our Constitution. Now let's think about this. In the 1780s, Washington gave a speech in where she said to the foreigners who had come over to America, mostly whites, mostly from Europe, and he said to them, "Take off your European skin and never wear it again." Jefferson said to him, "We should envision a country that has a democracy of opportunity and an aristocracy of talent." I would imagine there are several conservatives in this room who would applaud that statement, let alone everybody else. A democracy of opportunity, an aristocracy of talent. Then you had John Adams, who in 1814, having been second president of the United States, wrote to a friend and said, "You know, democracies don't last long. They waste and they wither and they murder themselves. I have never known a democracy to die except by suicide." Fascinating comment to come from the second president of the United States, and very strong stuff. But from the very beginning, America's so-called exceptionalism filled a warehouse with correspondence, research, statutes, and among them was separation of powers, which is now an issue. As you know, Mr. Trump is going to plead separation of powers to prevent the return of the papers he took from the archives. He's stating that as a president, he was not subject to the inquiries of the Congress. Separation of power. America's exceptionalism in developing a constitution and developing democracy was the wonder of the world. In 1950, almost every country in Europe and elsewhere was moving towards democracy. I went to Oxford in the late 40s, maybe the early 1950, and you've heard me say this before, some of you, I was treated like royalty. When they would say, "You're an American." Oh, wonderful people, wonderful things you did. You won the war. You know, the attitude towards America and its democracy as the beacon that the whole world wanted to move towards was astonishing to me. Absolutely, I really found it. I really felt uneasy because it seemed artificial, but it wasn't. It wasn't. It was a genuine admiration, and of course, a great deal that still exists. The question is, does our democracy exist, and how long can it endure in the current circumstances, in the environment, the political environment? How long can we expect it to survive? I think you probably noticed in the last couple of months how many times you heard a voice on television saying, "Our democracy. Our democracy is in dire shape. Our democracy is being threatened. Our democracy must survive." I've heard over and over again, "our." The use of the word "our" becomes almost a possessive. Indeed, it is a possessive. But what it speaks to is the fact that if you own it, you better take care of it. Have we taken care of our democracy? Have we taught young people in the schools what we, incidentally, all of us had when we were in grammar school? I know for a fact that very, very few people would say yes. And I taught a seminar for a while at Yale and found the creme de la creme. The brightest young people in the country knew nothing about the 14th Amendment, knew very little about the Constitution, and in many cases were almost totally unaware of American history in general. We have a record to look at and a lesson to be learned in that regard. Now, moving on. One of the remarkable aspects of constitutional democracy is the electoral process, which you've all been very conscious of in the last year, and which will, in 2024, achieve another pivotal moment. And that process, one man, one vote, goes back, of course, to the ancient Greeks and has always been something we thought we could wear on our sleeve with great pride. Now you have something called redistricting. You have something called gerrymandering. You have something called dark money. And you have an erosion of a free electoral process that may well suffer fatal consequences in the next 2 years. The idea that we would elect officials in states who could determine the results of elections no matter what the count was is unfathomable. But that is what is going on. I have listened and read and talked to professors about this for years and years. And gerrymandering, as you know, is done by both parties, and redistricting is done by both parties. But where does that leave one man, one vote? We are the only democracy in the world that elects judges. That may come as a surprise to some of you. No other democracy, they do not elect justice. They do not weaponize, politicize the process of selecting judges. How do you have a justice? Look at what's happening to the Supreme Court right now. They've had to reveal another embarrassing episode in February of 2014, second crisis for them. They're politicized by appointment, which we're all familiar with. How do you maintain justice in the face of that kind of activity? So I say, what are the remedies? What can we do? I personally think of our democracy still as something we might be able to rescue. I think there could be legislation that would redeem the earliest promise of a one man, one vote, clean election. I think it has to begin with education. There's just no way that we can expect to recover our democracy without having young people who understand the issues and understand the history. That's going to take generations. but it surely has to begin. I went to Russia in 1996 for the U.S. government, and I got on a bus one day with a very tall, skinny, blonde lady. It turned out she sat on the window and I sat on the aisle. And after I sat down, she leaned over and said, "You are American?" And I said, "Yes, actually I am." "How did you know?" She said, "You did not look around to see where the police were." She said, and then she smiled, she said, "I spent 2 years in Pittsburgh doing graduate work. My father," she said, "is an economist and a professor." And she said, "What hit me the hardest, what struck me," she said, "is how little American young people notice the freedoms they have that are virtually non-existent in any other part of the world. But you still have them," she said, "in your country." And she said, "I believe you must educate those young people so they do understand." And she smiled at me and she said, "If you do, they will enjoy it more and preserve it more." I thought, my God, a bus in Russia. We were on our way to Tolstoy's residence, and she comes up with that insight and remark, and she really was profoundly serious about the observation. The other education item I wanted to read to you, and I think I can do so. I must tell you that the reason why I'm very reluctantly giving up your company is that I have macular degeneration and my sight is recessing so rapidly that I can't read the newspaper and I can't read books without something like that or more sophisticated. So I got my secretary to do this in large type. I have a goddaughter in California, a wonderful, wonderful young woman who has taught and been part of the administration of one of the finest schools in California called Harvard Westlake. It's a private school. They recently had an incident, and this is what the headmaster wrote. "While it is not my practice to send a community-wide letter after every incident at the school that violates the rules or undermines our values, I do so now because what we discovered on Friday represents a much broader concern in the Harvard Westlake community and beyond. On Friday, we found the words, quote, 'Hitler rocks,' and a bunch of swastikas carved into a desk in an upper school classroom. These hateful words and symbols should cause all of us to feel pain, fear, and anger. This is an offense to all of us, not just our Jewish students and community. then lists 4 major projects that he's got the school working on to help educate students to combat whatever the significance of that is that might mean to them. He concludes his letter this way: this short list will grow longer, and our focused work will be ongoing, but it will take more than school programming for us to heal, grow, and become the kind of community Harvard Westlake aspires to be. What it will take is all of us. I ask that you join me in a renewed commitment to creating a school culture here where there is no hate, where everyone feels safe, and where everyone can feel full sense of belonging every day. I read that letter, and I hope you share some of my reactions. The idea that he would express those thoughts is one thing. Many people can do that. But the fact that he had an immediate action plan and put it, he since, by the way, sent out a second letter describing the almost universal activity at the school to combat this kind of thing and to understand it. However you may feel about that incident and its importance, the idea that education goes beyond the classroom and that educators can be so fundamentally important to the sustaining of democracy in this country. They have to combat these right-wing groups that are raiding the school boards and burning the books and God knows what else. But the fact that this man could write that letter and not feel his job was in jeopardy seems to me to be an encouraging signal of what I meant when I said we have to begin with education. Now, as a kind of final comment, I'll be 99 in May, so I've had a few years, and I've covered 11 presidents. And in that period of time, and in the general coverage of their activities, I have never before been afraid. I always felt we had a rule of law, and that the courts, by and large, even elected judges, were reasonably faithful to those laws, and therefore the courts would protect all of us. And for the first time, watching what's going on in certain states, listening to the extremists who have penetrated every part of our existence, I fear for America. I don't know whether you share that apprehension, but I genuinely do fear it. And I would say to you that the single most important enemy we have is the media. I don't mean the New York Times and Fox. I mean the big media, the social media, the Twitters and the Googles and the Facebooks. Because They have managed, and I've said this before in this room, forgive me for repeating, they have managed to make truth irrelevant. They have managed to destroy trust in our institutions. They have managed to set a tone of hostility and division that is almost insuperable. If any of you have looked at social media, you have some sense of what I'm talking about, but just take one statistic. Facebook has something like close to 4 billion members, subscribers, 4 billion. How would you like to be in charge of checking the messages that those 4 billion people send for misinformation? They had 45,000 people working on it according to their own claims, and they couldn't come close to how do you check 2 billion messages? And how do you check misinformation and disinformation? So I would offer this thought to you. It is not out of the question that the Congress could legislate regulatory measures that would make it a crime to run misinformation deliberately and knowledgeably. Number one. Number two, there is a shelter called paragraph 230 in the Communications Decency Act of 1990. There's a paragraph called section 230, which says you cannot sue Google or Facebook or Twitter for information placed in their facility by some third party. You can imagine how many lobbyists worked on that years ago. And the argument they made years ago was that unless you shelter these companies from lawsuits, they wouldn't be able to grow and survive and serve the public. It was all put in positive terms, and I would imagine some of that is true. It is no longer true. However, there is a congressional desk as I speak. Certain bills have been proposed that would make it possible to sue if you have been maligned or damaged, your reputation destroyed. And incidentally, there is no way one recovers a destroyed reputation when it goes to 4 billion people. There's no way. Lives have been utterly shattered by the capacity of these instruments to destroy what's left of our decency and restraint on the deliberate use of untrue information. The way they destroyed it was simply to make the word true a mystery. What's true? Whatever you believe in is true. And particularly if you repeat it. So I would offer that thought. People come from discussions on this subject and say, what can we do? What can we do? Well, we can do a lot. We certainly can press our Congress and Senate. We certainly can write and telephone. We certainly can fund good causes. There are things that everybody can do. And I would suggest that they deserve very careful consideration now and in the next 2 years before 2024 may be such a fateful election that it'll be inconsequential to try to remedy these things. So let me leave it there, or if you like, I'd be happy to take take questions. Yes?
Stan, I wonder if you might, clearly you thought all of those points were important in discussing this, but there are two that you did not touch on, and I'll admit, at least on the last, I'm somewhat ignorant about its purpose on the list.
Somebody forgive me, I only got about half of that. What was the question?
The last two items on your list, you did not touch upon them.
No,
and I'm sure they're important.
Yes, he
did.
I started that.
Weaknesses?
Demos and Parthenos.
He started democracy. Demos, the Greek words. Demo, people.
The two one about it.
Democracy. You did speak about it. The two Greek words.
Well, let me start with the weaknesses. What I meant there, and I did touch on it in a way, but I appreciate your calling me on it. What I see as weaknesses is that you have a Bill of Rights that has protected freedom of expression for 246 years. It's been through a lot of litigation and a lot of tests, but it has survived. And so freedom of expression permits you to say good things, constructive things, positive things, information that people need, etc., etc. It also permits you to use innuendo and distortion to produce misinformation, disinformation, hate literature, and confusion. So one of the weaknesses is that the seeds of destruction are in the very language of the Constitution. Madison and many of the founders believed that the only way our Constitution would survive is if there was a certain measure of goodwill, of civility, of respect in public life. And Madison himself said, I look around and see vast numbers of licentious people, but I also see vast numbers of people who are ready for self-government. That's the major weakness, is the strength of the freedoms that we've given to our fellow citizens and to ourselves. But beyond that, you have the effect of all kinds of commercial corruption and all kinds of twisted interpretations and evasions that high-priced lawyers protect you from, and that can so distort the process of free discussion, open discussion, public transparency. All those things are vulnerable. And I'm not suggesting there is an answer that's simple. Not at all. I am suggesting that education might encourage more of the values that we hope would grow in our society and justify the Constitution. Education is, of course, a deeply complicated matter. Yes?
Sam, what about the possibility of treating these outlets such as Facebook and Twitter and so forth as public utilities and regulating them in the federal system the same way we regulate public utilities like railroads and airlines and newspapers and so forth? Treating them as public utilities.
Facebook and others, treating them as public utilities. What's the possibility of that?
I think there's a real possibility. I think that's one of many remedies that are under consideration. Something the size of 4 billion subscribers we call the bus company and the trains are utilities or common carriers. And so no reason why Facebook shouldn't be as well. What they are pleading in their defense is constitutional protection. They're pleading First Amendment freedom of expression protection. They're arguing if you made it a utility, you would politicize it. The fact is, they're already politicizing themselves, of course, goes unmentioned. No, I certainly agree with that. And incidentally, you can go and sit in any major law school classroom and you will hear dozens of very intelligent and clever ideas for controlling the extravagances of the modern media without destroying its ingenuity and positive effects. These things are being looked at and are being considered. The problem is that the political system, particularly in these divisive times, makes it almost impossible to get anything done that is slightly controversial, as are almost all these issues. So you get back to education. If young people are educated enough to see what the frustrations are, what the corruptions are, how there is an enterprise called media literacy, which I've been talking about for several years, and anybody in this room who knows me has probably ad nauseum heard me talk about it. Media literacy is a program that's now in 23 states, and in 48 states there is some deposit of literature and correspondence on media literacy, which is teaching young students 4th, 5th, and 6th grade to be able to look at a computer and say, I shouldn't believe everything I see on that. Look at a computer and say, who wrote that? Why did he write that? What is it trying to do? Etc. All of that is showing enormous progress. Enormous progress. 5th graders coming up with truly sophisticated commentaries on the danger of misinformation. If that were universal, like saluting the flag was in my 4th grade class, I think it might have enormous positive effect. It is, do you all agree that media affects every aspect of our lives? Politics, economics, social issues, general informational controversies. Over and over again, social media is at the roots of our most troubling public issues. We just simply have pretty much ignored it, pretty much looked the other way. You've all heard many times, evil will triumph when good people look the other way. Americans have an enormous capacity for looking the other way, number one. Number two, we appear to have an enormous capacity for hate, for prejudice, for maligning fellow citizens. I mean, the amount of stuff that's going on the, if you go to the media, by the way, I'm sure very few of you do this, go and look at the the right-wing spectrum of the media, the people on the right, are saying things that defy reasonable imagination. So unacceptable and so foul and vicious, and I mean I found a couple pieces of writing that beautifully written, beautifully laid out, appearing on the screen, that just about violated every sense of decency any of us have. And that goes on every day, all day, and every night. And there is virtually no regulation for the moment. Nothing stops them except the disapproval of their fellow citizens. And in several cases, the fellow citizens have written to Google and Facebook to say they do not want to see any more of that stuff, and they will not buy any products, etc., etc. They've used common sense pressure and achieved some success. Mr. Trump was thrown off of Twitter because he abused the truth. That was the reason. He's going back on Twitter. Yes.
Would amendments to the Constitution help with some of that, where you have new laws that are in the Constitution that will protect the public from such abuse? Is it possible to add it?
You said the First Amendment?
No, I said, is it possible to amend the Constitution to protect us?
Possible to amend the Constitution to
Protect.
do some of these things that you'd like.
Of course. But it's possible always to amend the Constitution. Requires you're going through so much political maneuvering and getting 3/4 of the Senate to agree and 3/4 of the states to agree. I may have the numbers a little wrong there, but the mountain you must climb to get an amendment is pretty well discouraged. Almost every attempt at an amendment in many, many years. Gun legislation. Think of 400 million guns are in the hands of private individuals. 400 million, more guns in our society than people. And any move so far to even get a mental check. Think of those kids who were killed yesterday. Think of how many shootings you read about. When the hell are we going to become excited about that? What are we going to do? You remember there was a shooting in Florida at the Parkland School, and there a group of 20 of the brightest teenage kids I've ever heard got together and decided they were going to walk across the country and go to all the state legislatures and all the related think tanks and plead for action on at least a mental check, a background check. And they did. They did it. They've spent 5 years. Have they gotten any legislation? No. Do we, so John Adams said, democracies commit suicide. That's what we're doing. I don't see any other way of describing it.
What about a new Congress?
How do you...
How about a new Congress that would help change the amendment?
Now that there's a change, we have, Democrats have the Senate, but
A new
will
Congress.
that be helpful?
Yeah, new Congress.
Yes.
Next election.
And
Congress.
28% of the young voters, that's 18 to 35, voted in this last midterm election. 28%, higher than almost 4 out of 5 previous elections. 77% of the women who were registered voted. 72% of them for the Democrats. The little group of swing voters, which is 11%, 63% voted. Yes, you can, it's possible, but it requires, and incidentally, the idea that you as a group, that if we sat here for the next hour and had broken up in little groups and had talks and made notes and came together and decided we were going to create a document of outrage and send it to every congressman and senator. I did that in 2000, the year 2000. I wrote this petition and we put it up in the lobby. 206 of the residents signed it. 206, I don't think there were 260 maybe. You know, it was a remarkable output. Nonetheless, I was sitting there and a woman came up who shall be nameless, and she read the thing and shook her head, and I said, "Are you going to sign it?" She said, "No." I said, "Why not?" She said, "It's a Democrat trick." You know, that kind of thing. Yes, you can do it, and there are people who have spent their lives doing it, and really given up a lot to try and change the direction the country's going in. Yes, of course it can happen. Yes.
I'll buy your argument that there are a lot of people on the right who are out of line, perhaps criminally so. But don't you think that there are many people on the left who would change our government, our way of doing things in a manner that I would submit most people here would consider inappropriate?
The government is changeable, but don't you think there are as many people on the left who would be against that also?
Of course. The business of equating moral equivalence has always troubled me. I don't believe there is moral equivalence. One of them is worse than the other. But the fact is, there are people on the left, particularly the far left, who can do great damage and are doing great damage. But what is the difference between somebody who wants to give every household with a child $100 a month and somebody who wants to hang and shoot a whole segment of the population? Do you feel there's a moral equivalence?
No.
Yeah, if that continues, and we pay for it, name it, including college education. My son went to bank with mom and dad. I'll be damned if I want to pay for every kid who paid for his college the way I did by working for him. And I think it's totally appropriate to find that an inappropriate use of our taxes. At some point in time, our dollar will be about as worthless as the French franc was after World War II.
If you give away money to people who want to go to college free, we're not going to have enough money for people who are actually working.
I wouldn't quarrel with that. There will always be a spectrum of views, even in a highly civil society. And there were, in the very first days of this country, a vast difference between some people over here and some people over there. They had elections. Jefferson got elected on the third count or something because of the division of opinion. Yes, there will always be, that's the price of democracy. And that is why there are people who don't believe our democracy should survive. A lawyer named Lloyd Cutler, excuse me, was academics from all over the country, which he did. And they spent a year analyzing the Constitution and making suggestions on how to strengthen it. What did they come up with? Parliamentary government. Something like Britain, where you elect a party, and the party then chooses its leaders. Britain has a political season that is like a tenth of our political activity. They limit in money radically compared to what we have here. We now have dark money coming from extremely wealthy or radical or stupid people, but they don't have to identify who they are. Imagine Bill Buckley, who I'm sure some of you remember, always used to say, all you have to do is make people put their name and address on the check. Everybody's got to know who sent it and from where. There are solutions to that, but if you're going to have anything like freedom of expression, you're going to get differences of opinion. And is it going to be from the left? Sure, it's going to be from the left and the right. And you have to decide at times which one is the most onerous. Well, whether you decide it or not, you got to live with it. And you can then say, well, don't do anything. I think that's what a lot of people have done. Don't do anything. Look the other way. Listen, you've been fabulous. Nobody moved. Nobody went to sleep. I am going to miss you all in this room deeply, and I'm going to go on writing a little bit, so you're never going to get away from me in time. But I hope all of you have a happy Thanksgiving despite my dolorous account of the future of this country. Thank you very much.
On a lighter note, I arranged for some refreshments, and I asked, like some cookies, we'll pay for them. Oh, fine, no problem. There's 17 here. Help yourself. Welcome to Evergreen Woods.
Hello. How is she? Beautiful, is she? I just hope you What? She's taking a picture. What, love? She's taking a picture.
Oh, I'm not. Well, no, I don't want to say. I'm recording. Oh, whatever.
changing, right?
Oh, wait, how do your parents? They've moved down some other street, right? Oh, they have? I thought you were moving out to Brookside. That's the last time I saw
Oh, no, that was a long time ago.
Okay.
He had this big deal that, the market was gonna
I
crash.
know, I had lunch with
And
him.
then he'd sell low and then, sell high, and then he'd come back in low.
That never happened. So you're still on Everett Street.
Yeah.
We lived on Livingston.